My neighbor spends every day repainting his house. Jeremiah Jones is nothing if not the perfect example of the most stressful neighbor you could imagine. A perfectionist with artistic tendencies, however, I suppose he only ever got them because he is so addicted to the need of having everything right and clean at all times. I don't believe he was always like this. Before his wife passed away, you would hardly see him outside at all, except for when he came home from the office in his shiny Volkswagen. And now he has all this time that he uses for cleaning and renovation, and this almost daily. He's gotten older and stopped working, though his retirement money should be more than enough after all those years of work. I'm not sure, though. My mother says it is awfully rude to speak about money, especially other people's money. But that's dumb. It's just paper after all. Maybe being alone and having time is what evoked this hobby or addictive habit of his. Their house was never ugly or dirty when his wife was still there, but she was only out there occasionally. He is far more excessive with his approach. Anyway, Jeremiah Jones was so addicted to perfection that he wouldn't even take a chance of his home having any sign of dirt on the outside. And I mean that quite literally. It's not as if he watches for a bird or a tree to leave a nasty little mark so he can climb up and paint. No, he is constantly taking precautions matters by painting the roof and the walls every single day. Excessive, isn't it? Well, at the beginning it wasn't that entirely insane just yet. The neighbors even thought that it was a nice habit he had found to distract himself a little. You would see him out there with a big can of blue paint, and he was humming while painting the left side of the building. A few days later, the entire house was blue, and it looked kinda cool. An ocean blue home isn't something you see every day. He smiled, and he waved when I watched him from our porch. I waved back and even asked if he needed some help, but his smile swiftly disappeared. No, you would just do it all wrong. When I frowned at his words, he picked his smile up again and added, I'm just awfully nitpicky, you know. I nodded and went back inside. The day after he had finished painting it all blue, he was outside again at 5 a.m. when the birds weren't even up just yet. I woke from the sound of something heavy loudly hitting the pavement outside our door. I instinctively jumped out of bed and looked out the window to see what it was. And while my mind wasn't that sharp just yet, so early in the morning, I clearly saw blood. It was dripping down the window of Jeremiah Jones, and there was a big puddle of it on the floor next to the house. I screamed and shouted for my parents to call an ambulance. Terrified, they ran to my room, and as the three of us took another look, we realized that what I must have seen was red paint. Our neighbor was outside again, and the sound I heard must have been a can of red paint falling to the ground and spilling paint, the kind that he was using to go over the former blue walls. I suppose he had forgotten to paint a white layer first, as the color certainly didn't look as fresh and bright as the blue of yesterday. It looked messy and dirty. My parents walked outside that morning and talked to him, but I didn't hear what they said. I suppose they told him not to scare me in the morning. Mum was rather furious that he had to start painting so awfully early in the morning. When they came back inside, however, her anger had turned into concern. Poor man must be terribly missing Julie, she whispered. That was his wife's name, Julie Jones. Is this why he's painting so much? I asked her. Mum shrugged. She did love that home, and she always wanted things clean. I suppose it's a tribute Jeremiah spent the following days going over the walls and the roof until it was bright red, and not rusty red like crusty blood. In the afternoon, when I had just gone inside, I casually walked by and took a sniff of the wall, simply to prove to myself that it didn't smell of iron. I know I was tired in the morning, but I could have sworn I saw blood and not paint. However, all that caught my nose were the chemical scents of layers of paint. The following day I woke up by sounds from my never-tiring neighbor again. This time nothing was falling, but he was humming a familiar song. I looked outside, and when I saw him with another can on the top of his ladder and a colored tassel in his hand, I only rolled my eyes and snuggled back into bed. His humming turned into whistling, and I didn't get another minute of sleep. In the afternoon, Mum sent me next door with a casserole she had baked earlier that day to make up for her rude attitude towards Jeremiah the day before. She had even talked to other neighbors, and many were worried for the old man, being so lonely and alone. Many went over to offer their help or have a chat. He often loudly joined in the chats, but never accepted any help. It was his work to do. When I went over with the lasagna that Mum had made, he smiled and climbed down the stairs. "Tell your mother thank you, but that wasn't necessary. It must be awfully annoying to live next door to a construction site," he joked. I chuckled. "Oh no, that's fine. I really did like the blue, though." The home was now painted in a rather dark color, a mixture of forest green and brown. "I thought she would have to," he said in a sad tone, and I assume he meant that his wife would have liked it. I wasn't sure what to say at that moment, so I asked, was blue her favorite color? Mrs. Jones had given me piano lessons when I was younger, and I remembered the wall behind the piano was ocean blue. "I thought it was," he said with a half-smile, "though maybe it's not." He was saying those words as if he had painted the house to please her. Maybe that was what he was trying to do, an act of grievance, and maybe if he found the right color, he would be able to move on. I nodded sympathetically and let him continue with his work. I felt bad for being mad at him. He was only trying to find the perfect color after all. The next day it was yellow, and he had started even earlier in the day, when it technically was still night. Yellow was the most unfortunate choice because the dark layer the house currently had wasn't accepting of such a light color, though he didn't seem to care and used up at least a dozen cans of yellow paint before noon. After lunch, I went outside and asked why he didn't put up a layer of ground paint first. I wasn't exactly a professional painter, but it seemed logical to me. "Because it doesn't matter," he answered in a harsh tone. "It will always shine through." Then he proceeded to hum loudly, and I quickly went back home. Sympathy quickly turned into worry when he wouldn't stop for weeks. Every single day he was out there, especially after it rained. What a fortune he must spend on all this paint. He must have sold out every hardware store in town. "The layers must be incredibly heavy by now," my father said during breakfast, and it didn't seem as if Jeremiah was even enjoying his work. "Dad, how did his wife die?" I asked. I knew she had passed away very suddenly, but I didn't know any specifics. Dad looked uncomfortable. "Well, you see, Mrs. Jones had some health issues, but they weren't physical." He mumbled a few more words, but my father was never good at talking about serious topics. What I could make out of what he said, however, was that she had taken her own life. Inside that house, if Mr. Jones was the one who found her, I suppose that explained his trauma even more, especially if he never had much time for her. He even spent nights coming home very late for work. I suppose he was trying to make up for things in hindsight. It made me feel even worse for him. However, while his coping mechanism seemed to be helpful at the beginning, it clearly didn't seem healthy anymore. While used to be happily humming and whistling during his daily activity, it now sounded forced and wrong. He would become louder and more crooked. The song, however, was still the same, and it was loud enough that we could hear it at our kitchen table. The same melody that sounded awfully familiar, but not like something I would usually listen to. Even the song, Dad said as if he was reading my mind, wasn't it the one Mrs. Jones once taught you on the piano, black? That was the last color he used on the house, the darkest shade of black I'd ever seen before. He must have ordered it online as it was a new and unfamiliar brand. And while he had been cautiously and carefully painting each day before, he now had lost all motivation to do a clean job. He was splashing and pouring the dark color everywhere, layers on layers of dark paint dripping from the walls. Neighbors had gathered again. It was evening by then, and Jeremiah Jones was still outside with black splashes all over his clothes and face. Some tried talking to the man, who looked as if he hadn't been sleeping in days, but he ignored them. If he answered, then only by saying nonsense. And that's when I wondered if something else had happened to his wife, something he had been spared so far because he didn't spend enough time in that cursed home. His wife didn't seem that unwell to me, but I'd only been interacting with her during my piano days, which were a long time ago. However, she was certainly a little nitpicky herself. Possibly the time inside the home alone during those last years had taken a toll on her, and now that he was spending all his time at home, it was getting to her husband. I tried telling my parents, but they only gave me sympathy smiles. We're talking about a cursed house. Still, I was convinced there was something going on inside that place, and what I saw the night after the house was painted all black proved my suspicions. It was late at night. Mr. Jones had gone back inside just an hour back, and the whole street seemed to be sleeping. It was eerily quiet, as it is most nights on Campbell Street. Most people that live here are rather old and boring and go to bed very soon. So I must have been the only one awake and able to sleep. Maybe it was because I heard our neighbor hum and whistle each day. But I simply couldn't get that melody out of my brain until I realized it wasn't inside my head. There was a faint melody playing from outside in the dim street light. The Black Jones house was disappearing into the night. There was no light on the inside that I could see, but there was music playing very quietly. I'm not sure how to explain my next set of actions. Maybe I was still half asleep and not thinking well enough, but somehow the music got me so incredibly curious that I put on my sneakers and my jacket and walked out to our lawn. The melody was slightly more audible outside, but still very faint. I doubt it was really coming from the inside of the home. I knew Mrs. Jones had given her piano away many years ago, and the sound was not coming from Mr. Jones. I mean, of course, he could have been listening to it online or on CD, but I could swear that the music was coming from the walls, not from the inside. I swallowed and took a step closer, now wondering if I was completely out of my mind. I can't quite explain why I felt so drawn to it. Eventually, I had my ear pressed against the outside of the house and immediately moved it away again. as if doing what I was in that moment wasn't dumb enough already. I had forgotten that the house was freshly painted and therefore wet. I rubbed my face, expecting to see black on my hands, but the gooey substance on my skin was something else. This time it really did smell like iron. "The walls are bleeding," I whispered to myself, and that's when the window closest to the wall I was standing by opened up. Why? The creaking of the wood sent a shiver down my spine, and I fell back to the ground. "What are you doing?" Mr. Jones hissed. He was trying to be quiet, I could tell, but his eyes were bloodshot, and he looked more terrifying than I'd ever seen him before. "Do you want to join her? Is that what you'd like?" he added. I stumbled back, both afraid and ashamed. I couldn't even explain what I was doing there. I came here almost involuntarily, as if something was calling me. I opened my mouth to say something, but Jeremiah Jones was already grabbing the frame of the window, ready to climb out. The manic expression on his face was only growing worse. I tried to scream, but I was entirely in shock. Our neighbor had always been so kind and polite before the recent events. I was afraid the house had turned him insane. I tried to get up from the dirty ground, but Mr. Jones was almost outside, ready to jump me, and I swear he would have if the commotion hadn't woken someone else up too. Or maybe it was the fact that I wasn't lying in bed as I should have been, but when I heard the footsteps of my parents running towards the lawn and shouting, I was saved. Saved from whatever Jeremiah Jones had planned. More neighbors woke up, and the police were there soon. At first, Mr. Jones' explanations were sounding crazy, just as crazy as my idea of a cursed house. "It's bleeding. It's bleeding, it's bleeding," and singing. "She won't stop bleeding. She should have stopped." I will never know how any of what happened was possible. I still wonder if I really heard the music and saw the blood, because nobody else seemed to have noticed. Nobody but me and our neighbor. Jeremiah Jones saw the house bleeding each day, which is why he tried to paint over it. Maybe it was a punishment, or maybe she tried to warn us, and nobody saw. Because how could anyone have known that she didn't do this to herself, but that he was the one who made her bleed? Story 2. My neighbor is trying to ruin my life. Maybe they are your soulmate, or even a better version of you. That's what my friend Joe said when I told him about my downstairs neighbor for the first time. My neighbor who seemingly liked all the exact same things I did, but who I'd never met. Excuse me. Better, L laughed. He didn't elaborate, only grinned as a response, and then suggested we knock on their door. I met Joe through some other friends a year ago. After we realized that we live on the same street, we started hanging out more often. I'd moved to town a couple of years ago, right after college, for a marketing job I was lucky to get. Both of our jobs were mostly remote now, so we'd meet for coffee breaks or even work together at my place some days. This made him a witness to all the madness I would be going through, which I was truly grateful for, because I'm quite sure that any outside person would have thought I was going insane. Hell, for a while I even thought I was going insane. It all started with music. I lived on the 5th floor of an apartment building. The way the building was designed, there were 2 apartments on each floor, and from the outside each floor looked pretty much the same, except for shoes in front of the door or individual welcome mats and stuff like that. We didn't have an elevator, so I'd cross all the apartments on my way up and down. I started noticing the apartment right underneath mine when the tenant happened to listen to the same song I had been listening to before I made my way outside. I even ran back upstairs to my apartment because I thought I'd left my speaker on, but I hadn't. It was coming from the place downstairs. Funny coincidence, not more. The following day, though, it happened again. This time it was a not particularly well-known artist, but chasm exists. Maybe my neighbor and I had similar tastes, however. When this kept happening for days, I started thinking that it was a passive-aggressive way to tell me my music was too loud. I started using headphones, and there was no more music coming from the neighbor. But that doesn't mean it ended there. It simply switched to movies or series. I would walk by that apartment and hear the same things that I'd been watching earlier that day. Even the exact same episodes of shows, and even though I had really lowered the volume, about a week after it all started, Joe and I were working at my place. That's when I told him about the music and the shows. He suggested we knock on the door to see who this person was. I didn't see neighbors often in the hallway in general, but this particular one was a real mystery. The apartment under mine had nothing in front of it, pretty much like mine. I had a hallway inside my apartment where I left shoes and other things. They didn't open the door, even though we could clearly hear movement inside. "Hello," Joe called out, but there was no response. That's when the door of the apartment next to it opened where an elderly lady lived. I never interacted much with neighbors, but I'd seen her once or twice before. "Excuse me," I said in a soft voice. "Do you know who lives here?" I pointed to the other door. She looked at me for a while and then shrugged. "I believe it's a young woman. Moved in very recently. Why, I think my package was accidentally delivered to her." I lied. "Maybe try again later. She doesn't seem to leave her home very often. Poor thing." The lady smiled and started walking down the stairs. We didn't try again later. This girl seemed to be an introvert, and I didn't want to bug her, so she liked the same stuff as me or copied me. It was kind of funny, like she was following my recommendations. However, every day it seemed to grow slightly stranger. It went from media to food. I started smelling the same things I was cooking coming from her apartment. I know that scents can travel, but it was so strong right in front of her door. There was no way it was coming from my place. That was still fine, even though I have no idea when or how she got the groceries. I was home most days, and I'd started peeking out of my apartment every time I heard a door close shut. Our building was pretty poorly soundproofed, but every time it was only the old lady who might have started thinking that I was stalking her. The coincidences stopped being funny when one day I walked by and smelled my perfume. It was one that my mother had gifted me. She got it from a place where you can mix together your own choice of scents. Not only was it really unique, but I also hadn't used it in months. There was no way she could have just copied it. I told some other friends about it as well, and everyone agreed that it was creepy. This woman didn't just have the same taste as me, she was stalking me. I decided that I didn't want to hang around at home all day anymore, right above her where she could listen to everything I did. I realized that if she heard my shows on such low volume, she probably also heard phone calls I made or conversations I had with friends who came over. So I started going back to the office more often, just to get away during the day. I was sick of feeling observed. For a few days, that was fine. I hardly noticed anything from the mystery neighbor anymore. That is until I came home from work one day and my key wouldn't fit inside my door. I called the landlord. Luckily, he didn't live far away and came over shortly after. His face was all puffy and red from walking up the stairs, and he clearly wasn't happy that he had to come. "So what seems to be the problem?" he grunted, slightly out of breath. Even the old lady mastered the stairs better than him. "Like I said, my key doesn't fit the lock," I said, and demonstrated it. He quickly grabbed the key from my hand. "Let me see. Keys don't just stop working. You must have broken off a piece or something." "Well, is there a way to fix this?" He sighed and inspected the key further. Then he looked at me and started squinting his eyes. "Wait a second. Are you sure you're on the right floor?" I laughed. "Yes, I'm pretty sure I know where I live." He rolled his eyes and started walking off with my key in hand down the stairs. I followed him, but stopped on the last step when I saw that he had just opened the door to the apartment one floor below mine. That's impossible," I whispered. "Look, love, I know that these floors all look similar, but you should be able to count." "Yes." I didn't respond, still frozen on that step. "Next time, check where you are before you call." "Got it." He shook his head and started walking away, leaving my key inside the open door. He was already a floor down when I heard him whisper, "Fucking hate new tenants." I was sure I had walked to the right floor, but I was tired. Maybe I kept walking without thinking. Embarrassed, I finally started moving and went inside the apartment. However, when I turned on the lights, I knew that I hadn't made a mistake. This was not my home, but somebody tried to make it look like it was. When you step inside my real apartment, you get through a small hallway. All I have in it are a chair and a little closet for shoes and coats. This place had that too, but the closet and chair were made out of cardboard. It felt like I was going through an out-of-body experience. I couldn't stop myself. I stepped further inside, into what would be the bedroom. Just like in the hallway, everything in there were copies of my own furniture, made out of cardboard. In my real apartment, I used to have a bunch of pictures on the walls of friends and family members. Here I saw exact copies drawn by hand, all leaving out the faces of the people. My stomach started turning. I stumbled back to the hallway, out through the door, and towards the stairs. That's when I suddenly heard something from the upper floor. My floor. It sounded like a jingle, something I hadn't heard before. My heart was racing. I looked up, out of reflex, just for a second, and that's when I caught a glimpse of her. She had her arms over the railing, but her face was hidden. Then, only for a moment, she looked up and hid again. It was uncanny. This woman had my hair and was dressed in my clothes. Even her face resembled mine. It was only slightly off, as if she'd tried to copy it but didn't get it quite right. I opened my mouth but couldn't speak. A surge of anger filled me. I wanted to jump up there, grab her by her hair, and push her down the stairs. I can't even explain where that came from. I usually wasn't exactly hostile, but something was stopping my body from moving. I kept standing there until she looked up again. Our eyes met and the anger turned into fear. It's difficult to describe the feeling I had when she looked at me. Everything inside of me just turned dark, and I became nauseous and dizzy. She opened her mouth, but just like with mine, no words came out. Finally, she moved from the railing, and seconds later I heard her door shut. My door. I should have called the police or my landlord, but I didn't. When my body would finally move again, I ran down all the stairs through the door and didn't stop until I was in front of Joe's house. We were sitting on his sofa. My body was still shaking. The cup of tea Joe had made me had already turned cold. I told him what I saw. I told him everything. She's going insane. I need to call for help. That's what he must be thinking, I thought. But he didn't say anything like that. Instead, he patiently listened. When I was done, we both stayed silent for a while. Finally, Joe asked a question. "You're not gonna tell anyone, right, Maxine?" I wrapped my arms around my legs. This place was freezing. "I don't know how," I whispered. "Because they wouldn't believe you. You believe me, right?" I carefully asked. Joe smiled. He did believe me. I could feel that, but that wasn't all. He was eerily calm, as if none of the things I just told him were odd at all. "We could call the police," he offered, but it didn't feel sincere, and he smiled again. "But we're not. Because you saw her, and you felt it. You felt that she wasn't right, that she wasn't quite done yet, but pretty close to human, yeah." I looked at the guy who had been one of my best friends this past year, the person I had run to after I didn't know where else to go. I swallowed. "Don't worry," Joe continued. "Some need time to adjust. It took me a little bit, but now I feel absolutely, perfectly real." My breathing became slower, and his eyes were fixated on mine. Dun-dun-do-do-dun, the strange sound pulled me away from this trance I'd fallen into, the same sound I had heard coming from my doppelganger. This time it was coming from Joe's phone. He got up to pick it up, and I used that moment to jump up and run towards the door. He grabbed my arm just before I could and said one more thing. "She is the better version of you." Then he let me go. He didn't follow. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Joe didn't say it that specifically, but I knew what he had meant. Telling anyone wouldn't do any good. It might only harm more people. I moved back to my parents in the beginning. They asked a lot of questions, but they've given up now. All they know is that something traumatic must have happened to me. Slowly, I am coming back to my senses. I know that I didn't imagine any of that, but there are still so many questions that I can't answer. Like, why would they want my life, and what are they going to do with it? I also keep wondering if there is a real Joe still walking around somewhere, or if he got rid of him. The other thing is that I keep hearing that jingle. The other day I swore I heard it in the supermarket. Later a kid played it from their phone, and then I heard it on the television. This isn't just about me, and I can't stop wondering who else around me has been replaced. Story 3. Although he'd only lived there for a few months longer than us, by the time my family moved in across the street from the Phillimore house, his reputation was already firmly established. "My son, Bill, swears Bud tried to run him down in his car," Mr. Crane said. "He'll look for any excuse to yell at them. He says the most terrible things." Mrs. Pohl said. "My parents thanked them, but I don't think they quite believed them. Both of us had overheard our neighbors' warnings and were hesitant to even look at the house, much less approach it. "Go get it, Liz," Scotty said, nudging my shoulder. "But you threw it," I reply. "So you missed it. I couldn't reach it." "What the hell are you doing?" A stout man with thin, graying hair came bursting outside and stomped across his lawn towards me and my ball. I tried to say, pointing to it, "You brats throwing things at my house. Think it would be funny break a window, and no. I glanced over my shoulder to see Scotty half posed to run inside and whimpered. "Get out of here," Mr. Fillimore snapped. Can I just know? Before I could react, he'd scooped up the baseball, which had barely been touching his grass, and stormed back inside. The whole front of his house seemed to shake with the force of his slammed door. It was the first of what would be many run-ins with everyone's least favorite neighbor. Our parents tried to talk to him about his behavior, but he just told them to keep their noisy little shits off his lawn and away from his house if we didn't want trouble. Dad thought about calling the cops on him, but as Mom became fond of saying, there was no law against being rude. So we were told to just try and be more careful. He must not have always been such a bull, Mom said over dinner about a month after we'd moved in. He's married, you know. Dad scoffed at the idea. Oh yeah? How do you know? Dolores Devon was by again for a chat, and it came up. Bud wears a ring, and she said she sees Mrs. Fillimore looking out the windows from time to time, but the poor woman never comes outside. She thinks she heard Bud say it was cancer once. Poor lady, sick and married to that, Dad said. Terrible, isn't it? But it does explain a bit about him. He's just trying to keep things quiet and peaceful around his house. Yeah, sure, Scotty muttered, and Mom frowned at him. He's probably very sad and lashes out without meaning to. He's an asshole, Scotty said. Language, Dad warned, but yeah, he is. Whatever his reasoning, we all agreed it would be best to just try and avoid Bud Fillimore. Scotty and I were extra careful to keep all of our toys well within the confines of our own yard. When we played outside, I also couldn't help but keep a wary eye on the house across the street, just in case he decided to be extra crazy and we had to run for it. That's when I started to notice Mrs. Fillimore. She never banged on the window or shouted at us like her husband. She'd just stand there, watching us. I liked to imagine that she was a nice lady, a quiet neighbor who just enjoyed seeing kids at play. When I peeked out the living room window later, Mrs. Fillimore wasn't in her usual spot anymore. Eventually we got used to Mr. Fillimore glowering at us as he drove slowly past. His short temper and his loud voice, it was such a regular thing that our fear turned to caution, turned our rolling dismissiveness. Nothing until Scotty's remote-controlled helicopter. It had been a birthday present, and we were both eager to try it out. As soon as we finished supper, we raced out to the front lawn, where Scotty prepared for the helicopter's first flight. Under my brother's inexperienced and clumsy guidance, the helicopter lifted slowly from the ground and staggered drunkenly through the air. In his excitement to keep it aloft, Scotty didn't even realize it was heading right for Fillimore's yard until it was too late. Scotty, I tugged at his arm to try and turn it off course, but it only made things worse. The little helicopter took a nosedive straight into the hedges under Mr. Fillimore's bay window. Scotty frantically wiggled the controls, but the helicopter's blade was stuck fast in the thick greenery. As if he'd been waiting for us to slip up, the front door was flung open, and he practically pounced on the toy. "What have I told you?" he bellowed. Before we could argue, he had already disappeared back into his house upstairs. The curtain fluttered just so, and I knew Mrs. Fillimore was watching. I wanted to call up to her and ask her to get the helicopter back, but Scotty grabbed my wrist and dragged me behind him to find Mom and Dad. When our parents went over later, he refused to come to the door. He was fuming and furious, and he wanted his birthday present back now. But how, I asked. He paused, his gaze sliding to his window and the house beyond. We're going to take it. What about Mrs. Phillimore? She never leaves. You can distract her or something. I don't know. We'll figure it out. I dunno, Scotty, I said uneasily. I didn't want to disrupt a poor, sick lady for a few tours. Don't worry, we'll just be in and out. She probably won't even notice we're there. I doubted that, but I had a hard time saying no to my big brother. Immediately I had images of flashing red and blue lights and handcuffs, and my stomach turned sharply. But my brother whispered that it would be fine. He can't prove it was us. Everyone on the street hates him. He sounded so confident that all I could do was nod. Scotty reached carefully through the broken glass, careful not to cut himself, and found the deadbolt. It clicked out of place, and he pushed the door open, letting us into Mr. Fillmore's house. I clung to the back of Scotty's shirt as we tiptoed across the kitchen. It was spotless, obsessively so, and smelled of cleaning supplies. We cleared the whole downstairs pretty quickly, but there was no sign of our things. Shit, Scotty hissed. He must keep it upstairs. We listened to the soft padding of footsteps crossing from one room to another. Scotty, I whispered, grabbing at his sleeve with both hands. Let's just go. No, he went too far this time. I'm going to get my helicopter. Door hinges squeaked from somewhere upstairs, and the footsteps stopped. Scotty pulled his arm from me and scampered up the remaining steps. Reluctantly, I went up, too. We found a guest bedroom first. It was all muted colors and magazine-quality furniture, void of any warmth or personality, like it was just set up for show, never intended for use. At least it was a bit brighter up there. The windows only had a few layers of sheer curtains over them, enough to obscure visibility, but still let in light. The second room was obviously Mr. Phillimore's. It was the most lived-in looking room of them all, and even then that was only because there were some pictures hanging on the walls and some personal items on the nightstand. The bed was meticulously made. All the clothing, most of which was masculine, hung neatly in the closet. There wasn't even any stray hairs in the brush on the vanity. I wondered how someone could live in such a cold, lifeless house. There was only one room left upstairs, the one Mrs. Philemon must have gone into. Its door stood half open. Scotty and I traded a look, his determined, mine silently pleading with him to go. He took a step towards the door. In front of the vanity, posed on a tall stool, was a mannequin. She was wearing what I thought of as a 50s housewife dress, white with little pink and green flowers all over it, a string of pearls, and a blonde wig carefully combed back into a bun. Her featureless face was fixed on the mirror in front of her. Scotty's brow wrinkled, showing the same confusion as I'd felt. We'd both heard Mrs. Phillimore walk to this room, but there was no one there. Let's just go, I begged, a cold sweat starting to trickle down the back of my neck. Scotty shifted his weight, obviously torn, and the floorboard beneath his feet groaned. The mannequin's head turned sharply towards us. Scotty leapt back with a yelp, an arm thrown out protectively in front of me. Liz. His voice was trembling. Run. I stumbled back down the hall on legs that didn't want to work. I could hear Scotty stomping along behind me, and behind him, a rapid skittering. We skid at the top of the stairs, and I grabbed the railing to keep from falling headlong down the steps. While I righted myself, I dared to glance back down the hallway. It was empty. Where did G? Something thudded against the ceiling. We both looked up and screamed. The mannequin was crawling, spider-like, over our heads. She wrenched her head completely around, turning her blank face towards us, and flitted towards the wall. She started to descend, the whole time facing us. And then Scotty was shrieking. I spun. The mannequin was crouched on the last step, one arm outstretched. She had her fingers wrapped around Scotty's ankle. They were tightening, until his bone started to crunch beneath her grip. He kicked at her with his other leg, but it did nothing. She started to drag him back towards the stairs. "Scotty," I screamed. But before I could move, he looked up at me and shook his head furiously. Terrified cries that chased me out the same door would come in through. It was the last time I ever saw my big brother. No trace of Scotty was ever found. My parents searched. Police searched. There were dogs and special agents, and tons of time, money, and energy were put into trying to find him. But none of it mattered. It was as if he had simply vanished. Bud Fillimore wasn't a suspect very long, with no evidence and no history of any kind of criminal record. He was let go. Scotty was dubbed a missing child, reduced to a single box of paperwork that was all to soon move to the cold case stacks. No one believed me when I told them what really happened. They all said Scotty must have been kidnapped on our way back from Mr. Fillimore's house, and I was too young to really understand it. That I had gotten confused and, in my fear, made up some story using the scary thing I'd just encountered. Mr. Fillimore's mannequin belonged to his late wife, Sharon. He kept it after she passed because it reminded him of her. Sometimes he'd move it around, put it in a window, but it wasn't alive. You understand that, right, Liz? My therapist was fond of asking. I told her what she wanted to hear, even if I knew it was a lie. The adults preferred it that way. It was easier for all of us. Maybe that was why I never showed anyone the note that had been left taped to our door, typed and anonymous, that just said, "I tried to keep you away." I didn't think it would have changed anything. I knew, though, and I never doubted myself for the fact that Scotty had sacrificed himself for me, and up until Mr. Fillimore packed up and moved a few years later, I would sit in my brother's room and I would stare out the window at his house. I would watch the second-story window, waiting for the telltale dark figure to appear behind the curtains, waiting for the quiet neighbor that everyone said did exist. Story 4. My new next-door neighbor is strange. I have a new next-door neighbor. I met him when I was waiting for the elevator in my apartment building. The building I live in is a run-down piece of crap, however. It was the only place I could afford. I was tired, arms sore, and I did not want to take the stairs. I stopped because someone reached over to press the button to get no response. I've never seen him before. He was a head taller than myself and in good shape, his hair neat and gray even though he only looked 30 at the most. My building was full of poor families and some drug addicts. He looked over at me when I moved, his gray eyes staring me down. I felt sweat start at the back of my neck from his intense gaze. I started to feel like I was going to puke from stress when he jerked a thumb at the still closed doors. Broken, he asked me He had a hint of an accent I couldn't place. I let myself exhale a breath I didn't know I was holding. I nodded my head, still not ready to speak. He looked around the lobby and found the stairs. Because of so many break-ins, the landlord locked the stairway to the upper floors. I scurried along, carrying my heavy bags, trying to pass him as fast as possible. I went up the stairs first, but slowly. He should have been able to pass me without any trouble. The man stayed behind a few steps, and it stressed me out again. I stammered out an apology as my bag of oranges broke and tumbled down the stairs. He looked like the type to get angry instead. He just shook his head and helped me back on my feet. Silly boy, help. That time I caught a Russian accent when he spoke, one he was poorly trying to hide. The next few minutes we both started to gather up the spilled oranges from the stairway. He tied the bag, but didn't hand it back to me. Silently, he was telling me he would carry the broken bag of food and my carton of eggs to my apartment because I could not be trusted. My face was red from embarrassment. People never helped me out, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I just muttered out another thanks and let him follow me to the 4th floor. When I stopped in front of my door, he did a double take at the number. "You hear him there?" he said, pointing to the door next to mine. I knew my neighbor moved out last week. I didn't hear anyone moving since, and wondered when he arrived. "Oh, I didn't hear you move in," I commented, thinking I would at least have seen him before now if we lived next to each other. Not much a move. "Tell me your name." It sounded like a demand, and I stuttered for a few seconds. "Richie." I mentally kicked myself after I spoke. No one called me Richie. I had no idea why that came to mind. Not even my mother shortened my name. Nice to meet you, mister." It was far too late to correct myself and tell him my name was really Richard. I just asked for his name instead. He froze, looking like a club bouncer who was about to toss out a drunk. It felt like I just made a big mistake. Clearing his throat, I flinched. "Dmitri," he said finally. I had a feeling it was a fake name, just the first one that came to mind. I need to put the weird feeling I got out of my mind. After all, he was nice enough to help me out. I should treat him a bit better the next time I saw him. The strangeness with Dmitri kept going. The next day I was awoken by a knock on my door. "Is everything all right?" I didn't have a clue what he could need more for. Maybe there was something wrong in his apartment and couldn't get a hold of our landlord. "Give me your work time," Dmitri demanded, and it made me confused on what he meant for a few seconds. After thinking, I realized he wanted my work schedule. I didn't have set shifts, rather worked whatever they needed me for that week. It's on my phone. Do you want me to get your number and I can text you when he'll be at work?" I asked. He nodded, and I went back inside to retrieve my phone. His looked like a cheap burner phone when he pulled it from his pocket so we could exchange numbers. After I sent the text, he nodded, looking my hours over. I suddenly regretted it. It looked like he was planning on using this information for nefarious purposes, or I was really just overthinking. "I work at home," very loud, "only when you are not home." With that vague explanation, he left me standing in my PJs, door open, and trying to make sense of what he just said. Whatever he did for work, he didn't want to disturb me, but also didn't want me hearing anything. That could mean he was into some adult work or something illegal. He looked more like the mob type, and I leaned more towards that. I didn't see a motorcycle in the parking lot and wondered if he rode one. When we saw each other, he would give me a curt nod in acknowledgement. I thought that was how we would treat each other, not speaking and just giving a neighborly nod. Am starting to wonder if I'm clumsy or just have bad luck. I put a bottle of aspirins on top of the fridge, one arm resting my weight on the cupboard and the other reaching for the bottle. I heard a soft creaking the second everything came tumbling down. My shoddy cupboards were not nailed into the wall properly. Unable to support my weight, it came off the wall, smashing against my head and spilling its contents on the way down. I stayed down on the floor, head pounding for a while. I felt sick and dizzy from the pain. My cell phone on the counter out of reach. I could only hope the cut was minor. I could not afford a trip to the hospital. Richie, I looked up, the movement killing my head. Dimitri stood in my kitchen doorway, looking down at me. I locked my apartment, so how did he get in? I stopped speaking because the pain was so great. I really didn't need to explain what happened. It was pretty obvious. I called Dr. Dimitri said and pulled his phone from his pocket. It looked like a different one than before. I opened my mouth to protest, but one look from his steel-gray eyes was enough to shut me up. I sat, holding a damp towel to my head as he spoke to a doctor in the other end of the phone. 10 minutes, he announced after he hung up the phone. How did you get in? I finally asked. Lockpick. The doctor arrived and Dimitri let him in. The man pulled up a chair in front of me to get a look at my cut. He set down a bag on the table next to us. He looked like a doctor from the 1800s. His glasses were round, gold-rimmed. He was dressed in a vest with a button-up shirt underneath, his black hair styled perfectly back in the same way every man in the 1950s wore it. He took a pen light out from his bed so at least his tools weren't old-fashioned. He shone it in my eyes and made me follow it. No brain damage, so that's good. Just a lot of blood on a minor cut. Dimitri could have dealt with this himself, but I suppose he wanted to make sure your brains weren't. Scrambled, the man introduced himself as Dr. Philo before sitting down and looking me over. His tone was stern, but somewhat fatherly. I'm sorry to bring you over here. I'm sure this is out of your way, and I could have gone to the hospital, I said, suddenly feeling embarrassed. Making house calls is part of my job. A lot of my patients can't make it to my clinic for various reasons. I winced as he fully cleaned the cut and started to stitch it up without giving me any warning. It was only 3 stitches, but it still hurt. Noise came from the kitchen as Dimitri cleaned up the carnage that was once my dishes. He's an all-right guy, even if he looks pretty scary. I kept talking, trying to distract myself from the pain. He doesn't look like the type to help out like this. I think he just doesn't want to move again. If you look past what kinds of people live in this area, then this place is pretty good. Cheap rent and close to everything you need, the doctor explained. When the cut was dealt with, he put his tools back into his leather bag. When the tools were put away, he took out a thermos and a box of cookies. I recognized the store name. I could never afford to buy anything from the bakery they came from. It was very popular and way beyond my budget. He poured a small cup of tea that smelled like flowers. I've never seen a kind of tea that smelled that sweet and was a pink color before. Here, drink a little of this and eat something. I have a pill to help you with the pain, but you need to have something in your stomach first. My head did hurt, but it was manageable. I didn't want to bother with extra medicine if I could help it. Trying to get some aspirin got me in the mess to start with. No, it's fine. It was not fine. Dr. Philo sat, glaring me down with the thermos lid of tea still in his hand for me to take from him. I realized how rude I was being. He brought very expensive tea and cookies, and I was refusing them. The cookies were the best I've ever had, and the tea was as sweet as it smelled, but not an overpowering sweetness. I wanted to ask him what brand, but I feared it would also be out of my budget. I sat sipping away, feeling a bit embarrassed again. I had to strangers in my apartment because I didn't just go and find something stable to stand on. I would need to think of something due to for Dmitri to thank him for this. When I finished a few cookies, the doctor gave me a pill to take. I should have been a bit more wary of taking pills from strangers. After all, I didn't actually know Dmitri. I trusted him and the doctor without a second thought. You're going to be asleep for a few hours. If you're working tomorrow, cancel your shift to rest. He'll write you a note if you need one. I opened my mouth to argue, but that was my last memory of that night. I woke up in the morning, head heavy and very confused on how I get into bed. My blood shirt was missing and I was wearing a clean one. I sat up, looking around, trying to recall anything from that night beyond talking with the doctor. When nothing came to mind, I walked out into the kitchen to see the damage, and saw nothing, not even a speck of blood on the floor. New cupboards were installed on the walls, and I tried to shake them to see if they were fastened tight. This time I was still missing most of my plates and cups, but I wondered how I slept through someone coming inside the kitchen and replacing the cupboards. I called my boss telling them I wouldn't be in that day. I felt fine though, not even a trace of a headache. It was the best sleep I've had in months. My boss told me someone already arranged for me to take the day off. He hung up and did not elaborate further. My job was very against someone calling in for another person. You could be in a coma, but still expected to be the one calling in. I wondered what kind of strings Dmitri pulled to get me the day off. I didn't know when he worked and what times he was home. I went next door and knocked, hoping he would be in so I could thank him. I could have just sent him a text, but I felt as if it should be in person. The door opened and he looked down on me, his cold expression never changing. Thank you for helping out. Did you ask the landlord to replace my cupboards? I said in a small voice, no, I did woodworking as a hobby. Overnight this man rebuilt an entire set of cupboards for a stranger. I tried taking a peek inside his apartment. It looked like an identical L setup to mine. His hallway had plastic sheets covering the floor. This is going to scar. Oh, I said, adding nothing useful to the conversation. Oh, the second exclamation was because I finally clued into why someone who looked so threatening went out of his way to help me out. I'll make you dinner. As a thank you, I stuttered. Mentally, I was screaming at myself because I was making this entire exchange even more awkward. Dmitri kept his stone-cold expression on his face, not looking to notice my panic. Do you like dogs? The question was so out of the blue it made me pause. Yes, it'll make you a dog. Go rest. I need to do work. Without any further explanation, Dmitri went back inside his apartment and closed the door. I did pull him away from painting, so I didn't think him suddenly ending the conversation as rude. Trying to think what his last statement meant would drive me crazy. I went back into my place, having a few things to think over. First, I needed to figure out what my next-door neighbor would eat. He did seem to be the type to be picky. The dog comment I figured out he said woodworking was his hobby, so maybe he was going to make me a dog out of wood. But why? Just because he has extra material around. The last thought I was doing my best to push from my mind. I did everything not to think about it. It kept creeping at the edge of my thoughts, and I finally needed to admit defeat. I snapped while staring at pasta boiling in a pot, completely mortified over the idea my neighbor might like me, really like me. I've never been interested in guys before. The problem was I'd never been interested in girls either. I just assumed those feelings would come along when I saw the right women, and never would have expected to find myself making dinner for my male neighbor. I lacked any friends, and due to some long, dramatic family history, I was not in contact with any of them. In fact, I never really had any close friends. I might just be getting my signals crossed on how I felt due to lack of experience. I brought the still hot pasta over next door and not feeling like I wanted to make a run for it. When the door opened again, I jumped. Unable to say anything, I held out the containers of food. "Many thanks, I wash these. Bring back later," Dmitri said with a nod, taking them from me. He sounded as if he was trying his best to hide his accent, as if he didn't want me to know where he was from. "They're just plastic. You can keep them if you want." I told him with a shake of my head I now had more plastic Tupperware than real dishes. I washed them. "Here is dog for you." Placing the containers on a table just inside the door, Dmitri picked up a small wooden figure. I held out my hand to take it from him. It was a goofy-looking pot carved from wood. Honestly, the detail to the wrinkles were impressive. I thanked him again and realized every time we met I always had something to thank him for. In his cold manner, he shooed me away. "Go rest, I work." Again, the door was shut on my face without me minding in the slightest. My shifts at work became more regular. Instead of just coming in when needed, I had a set schedule. It meant I could budget my finances better. If I saved, I could move into a better area of town or closer to my job. Things might have worked out just fine if my job didn't give me a surprise day off. I heard Dimitri's voice from outside, so I knew he was just getting home. The next sound was muffled, but I could have sworn I heard a scream. I knew I was looking at Dmitri from his frame, but not by his face. I only saw it for a few seconds, but the image is burned into my memory. His face was split open horizontally. Thousands of needle-like teeth along the slit of a mouth glimmered in the dim light of his apartment. His eyes warped and twisted from his monstrous face locked onto me. The terrifying mouth closed in seconds after we made eye contact, his face returning to normal, but with his mouth slightly open at a loss for words. The other person in the room looked equally as shocked. "You do not work tonight?" Dmitri asked, breaking the silence. The man with the knife to his neck said nothing, his eyes wide and pleading. "What do you have?" he slowly asked. "Curry. Enough for two." I normally gave him enough for 2 meals because he was a bigger guy than myself. I always assumed he ate more. Even while I spoke, my mind screamed at me to run. That my kind neighbor just killed a man, and he was going to kill another if I hadn't stopped him. I dreaded that I was going to be next. I'd seen what happened and needed to be taken care of. All the hints I'd brushed off came crashing down in my mind. The sketchy doctor, how easy he could clean blood from my floor, the plastic sheets, and never the smell of paint, how often he moved. Everything was staring me in the face, but I was so desperate for a friend I ignored all the red flags. I held back a noise of fear, and Dmitri let go of the man and pushed him aside. In a few steps he was in front of me, his tall figure looming. The knife was still in his hand, but pointed down. I knew if he wanted, he could kill me in a blink of an eye. I flinched, a small sound escaping me when it raised a hand and ran a thumb over where my stitches had been. Did not scar badly. Getting down on my level, he leaned over so his face was close to my own. I felt my muscles turn to stone as I looked into his steel gray eyes of a killer looking me over, deciding my fate. My hand started to shake and I almost dropped the food. Dmitri placed a hand on top to steady the containers and was so convinced I was going to die I nearly passed out. Still friends, his voice was low and had a hint of worry in it. My heart was so loud I nearly didn't hear him. Friends, he wanted to know if I was still going to act friendlier on him. I risked a look over his shoulder and at the man who looked as scared as I was. I made my choice. I nodded. If I kept my mouth shut, I would live. After I nodded, he took the curry from my hands and stood up. You, table, we eat dinner. Richie, best to go back home. My cell phone sat on the counter. I looked at it, debating on what I wanted to do. I should call the cops. I witnessed a murder. My next-door neighbor killed someone. Without any doubt, he had done it before and would keep doing it unless he was arrested and stopped. I couldn't believe the supernatural aspect of what I saw. I could believe in murder, but not split-faced monsters. My hand hovered over my phone as I repeated the facts inside my head. I let out a yell of frustration and walked away from my phone. It could only be one person. He knew I was home, so no sense on trying to hide from him. Cautiously, I opened my door. To my shock, the man who Dmitri was about to kill when I walked in was still alive. His face bruised, but he was breathing. We wanted to thank you for dinner. My friend will be leaving. The man gave me a nod, his face pale and hands shaking at his side. Still friends? Dmitri asked me again. Still friends, I confirmed with a small nod. That was enough for him. He took the man by his arm and dragged him down the hallway. If he was going to let him go free or kill him somewhere else was a mystery. I would never know the answer. I never ended up calling the police or telling anyone what I saw. I saw Dmitri a few times in the hallway in passing, but face looked strained. He knew I wasn't going to get him arrested. It was far too late by now. He would have covered his tracks, and I doubted the cops would take me seriously. Any normal person would have done the right thing and gone to the cops right away. I felt pretty guilty for not doing so. Gathering up my courage, I offered him the food and asked, something I'd wanted for a while. Do you want to eat together? He nodded his head, this time the one, being unsure of what to say. My neighbor is a killer, and well, something not human if those few seconds of memories are real. But oddly enough, I really don't mind. I've been pretty lonely 4 years, and eating a meal with someone is something I desperately want. Murder or not, human or not, at least he was nice enough to sit and eat with me as I talk about my day. Story 5. My neighbor has been digging a hole in his backyard. It's starting to drive me crazy. Shink. PSHH. Shink. PSHH. Imagine hearing that for hours on end while you're trying to get some sleep. I already knew 't wasn't going to be the most idyllic place to live, nor was the house itself all that nice when I saw it. Still, it was good enough, however. It'd be dishonest of me to leave out the real reason why I decided to buy the place. It was cheap. Not cheap enough to immediately raise any red flags, but it was at a price that I'd be foolish not to consider. On top of that, I knew the previous homeowner, Tom, not terribly well, but he was a good enough guy as far as I could tell. I asked him about the neighbors as well, and he told me not to worry, since the woman who lived on the house to the right was pleasant and mostly kept to herself. But what about the house to the left? For a moment, it almost seemed as if he were taken aback by the question. "Oh, Dave," he responded after a moment of silence. "As a nice enough guy, I think he lives alone. Also keeps to himself. I can't imagine that he'd bother you at all." In retrospect, it was a bit of a strange response, but at the same time, to say that Tom wasn't a bit strange himself would have been a lie, so I opted not to think anything of it. I mean, what else could I ask for? There were 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms in total. Since I lived by myself, I could make some more money by renting out the spare room. Quite honestly, it was a great setup. This was in no way a normal occurrence for me. The hole had doubled in size. I must have stared at it for half an hour as I tried to reel in my disbelief. What was this motherfucker doing? When I went to bed that night, I stayed awake on purpose. At around midnight, I started to hear it. Shink, P-S-H-H, shink, P-S-H-H. Like a hellish clock that wouldn't stop ticking, I kept track of the time. 12:30, 1 o'clock a.m., 2 o'clock a.m. It went up all the way until 5 o'clock a.m. 5 goddamn hours of digging during the dead of night. This had to be a joke, right? What was this guy trying to do? Elicit a reaction from his neighbors? Was this just the most obnoxious prank feasible? Well, if he wanted a reaction, then I was going to give him one. As soon as the sun came up, I stormed over to his front door and rang the doorbell incessantly. He did answer, of course. Fucking pussy, I thought to myself as I started banging on his door instead. "Hey, buddy," I yelled, "quit the fucking digging, or I'm gonna kick down this door and kick your ass as well." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, knowing that he might very well be recording everything that I was saying. I didn't want to get into any legal trouble, after all. At least dig during the day, I said in a softer tone. "Seaman pal, give me a break." I waited a few more minutes for a response, but he didn't come. I just went back home, hoping that he'd gotten the message. I decided to give Tom a call later that day. I asked him whether or not Dave had done anything like this before, and if he had, why he hadn't warned me about it. "Digging holes," Tom responded. "That is weird." He nearly paused for a whole minute after, leaving me with the sounds of his heavy breaths over the call. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I asked. "Seaman man, I think I'd just try and ignore it." He finally responded. The nerve of this guy, I couldn't believe it. "Obviously, that's not happening," I said. "If this guy keeps doing it, I'm gonna break into his house and toss his shovels into the ocean myself." I wouldn't confront him. Tom's reply is suddenly toned soft and timid. Why the hell not?" I asked. He went silent for another minute before hanging up on me. I called him back to more times, but he wasn't picking up. I was starting to figure out why he'd sold it to me for so cheap. He didn't have the balls to confront the guy himself, so he just sailed ship. Well, that wasn't going to be me. I didn't even try to go to sleep that night. I sat down in the living room with a cup of coffee at midnight, waiting for that bastard to start digging again. Sure enough, he did. As soon as I started hearing that godforsaken noise, I stormed out of my front door. This time I wasn't going to waste time knocking. I was going to confront that asshole directly. I approached the gate leading into his backyard, only to find it wired shut. What the hell, I thought to myself. I pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge in the slightest. Asterisk, what a fucking pain, asterisk. In a fit of rage, I kicked at it, causing the entire wooden frame to shake. The guy didn't even seem to care. He just kept digging. It was loud, so obnoxiously loud. I was really nearing my wit's end. In fact, the sound of it was so overbearing, it nearly drowned out the soft tapping that was coming from beside me. Wait, I thought. What is that? I looked over and nearly had a heart attack. There was somebody looking at me through the window at the entrance of my neighbor's house. My eyes adjusted after the initial shock of spotting him, and I was able to discern a man in his mid-late 30s. He had a petrified expression on his face as he looked at me. He put a finger up to his lips and shook his head, as if he were warning to me stop what I was doing. My bravado disappeared in an instant. The despair on his face was palpable, filling me with a deep, sinking sensation in my stomach. As I stood there, still deliberating about what to do, the digging suddenly came to a stop. I could feel my fight-or-flight senses kicking in. But it was different this time. Before, I'd only get that feeling when I knew what the danger was and could see it in front of me. This time I knew that I had to get away before the danger could present itself at all. I heard a shovel drop and the sounds of heavy footsteps coming from the gate beyond. I didn't stay to find out what was walking towards me. I didn't sleep well for a week after that incident, but not because of the sounds. The digging had since stopped, and the hole hadn't gotten much bigger, but I knew that was just because it was getting deeper. Yesterday, I finally worked up the courage to go into his backyard during the day, since the digging only seemed to happen at night. I tried ringing my neighbor's doorbell again, but he's not answering. He obviously doesn't want to talk to me about it. I climbed over the fence and cautiously made my way towards the hole. At that point, it was taking up a considerable portion of the grass space. Of course, a shovel was lying beside it. I took a closer look at it, seeing the deep imprints of bulky fingers on the bloody metal handle. And then I looked down into the hole itself. I couldn't tell you how deep it was exactly. However, I could see nothing but the void below, just pure darkness. I went back into my house and found a piece of rope that I measured to be 30 feet long. I tied a water bottle to the end of it and went back to the hole before slowly lowering it down. I ran out of rope in no time, but I never heard a thud below. When I brought it back up, the bottle was covered in some kind of thick, dark goo. I just dropped it back down, along with the rope. I wasn't touching that. I continued kneeling there for minutes afterwards, waiting for a confirmation that it had hit the ground below. It never happened, or maybe it was so far below that I wouldn't be able to hear it at all, even if it did. In any case, that little experiment brought me no peace of mind. It yielded no answers at all. I still doubted that I would be able to get any sleep. At the very least, the digging had stopped, and over the next few nights I actually managed to get some shut-eye for a few hours at a time. I just wouldn't think about the hole. It didn't matter, and it would have no impact on my life. Soon enough, my sleep schedule was back on track. My life was going back to normal. I could smile, knowing that this incident would just be a strange one-off in my life, a story that I could tell at parties. I drifted off to sleep tonight without a worry in my head. I prepared myself to have a nice dream, something I hadn't had in a while. Instead, I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, my entire body shaking. Another nightmare, the worst one I've ever had yet, and it didn't end when I woke up. The digging was back, even louder this time, almost as if it were coming from my own backyard.